All right. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us this morning. This is the Oregon Energy Strategy Transportation Working Group meeting. I think we have enough folks here, so we're going to get started. I know many of you that I see in the participant list, but for those who don't know me, my name is Jillian DeMedio. I'm a senior policy analyst at the Oregon Department of Energy, and I am the transportation lead for the Oregon Energy Strategy. You were all invited today to lend your expertise given your roles at your respective organizations. And we're going to be talking about transportation related data sources and assumptions that will feed into our energy strategy technical analysis, as well as priority what if questions that we would like the model to potentially answer for us. Edith, can you go to the next slide? So before jumping into this morning's discussion, just a few notes on how to use the WebEx platform for those who are not familiar. All working group members should be panelists in this meeting, so you should be able to mute and unmute yourselves as well as turn your cameras on and off. A couple notes on that. Please make sure to mute yourselves when you're not speaking to limit the background noise and distractions for other participants. We also invite and encourage you to turn on your video today so that we can all see each other during this meeting, especially during the discussion portion of today's meeting. And you can do that with the Start Stop Video button on the bottom of your screen there. You can also change how your name is displayed, and we do encourage you to add your organization and your preferred pronouns if you'd like to your name. If you'd like to raise your hand or react to something that's been said, you can do that with the reactions button or by clicking the hand icon next to your name in the participant list. We are going to be taking questions and comments in the order of raised hands, so I definitely encourage folks to use that option. Lastly, you can use the chat function for questions and comments as well. We're going to be paying attention to both during the meeting. I don't see anyone dialing in, but if there is anybody that is joining us from the phone today, you can hit *3 to raise your hand from the phone. And then members of the public that are joining as attendees, you are only able to message with Abby, who's going to be helping out with any technical issues that come up. So you can write to her and let her know if you're having any technical issues. All right, next slide. Great. So I'm just going to ask everyone to mute themselves. I do hear a little bit of background noise right now, so just check to make sure that you're muted. So first, with the technical piece behind us, I want to start with a quick grounding in the purpose of this working group. As I've said, you've all been invited to participate because of your expertise and experience in the transportation sector. And we brought you all together because we really want to hear your thoughts and questions and use your insights to inform the development of our state's energy strategy. The purpose of this working group is for all of you, the working group members, to engage in conversation. We're really hoping that you come to an understanding of the foundational data sources and modeling assumptions that will form the basis of our reference scenario in this technical analysis. It's also an opportunity to ask clarifying questions. It's an opportunity to provide expertise and feedback on these key assumptions related to transportation and really discuss the pros and cons of any recommended changes that come out of this conversation today. And then lastly, as I've said, to discuss these what if questions and priorities that may inform the various scenarios that we analyze through this analysis. Just a reminder that today's focus is on the modeling for the energy strategy. We will work on developing policy recommendations in phase 2 of this project, which will start early next year. So I'm here to facilitate this conversation and really gather and summarize insights provided by this group. Along these lines, just a few ground rules for the meeting. As already mentioned, we do encourage folks to turn on your cameras when we get to our discussion so we can all see each other and sort of feel like we're sitting in a room together. We ask that everyone listen carefully to other perspectives, seeking to learn and understand, keep an open mind, respect differing opinions, and be conscious of speaking time so that everybody has the opportunity to contribute if they wish to. So next slide. So you should all have received this agenda about a week ago, and it hasn't changed, but just to quickly review, we're right now in the middle of welcome and introductions. I'm then going to give a quick presentation to sort of set the stage, discuss the scope of this project and where we are in the overall process of the energy strategy. And then I'm going to turn things over to our lead modeler, Jeremy Hargreaves from Evolved Energy Research. And he's going to talk specifically about how transportation is considered in this broader economy-wide model. We'll then jump to two guided discussions. The first is around the reference scenario data sources and assumptions. And the second is around transportation-related what-if questions that can potentially be modeled through an alternative scenario. We will wrap up with next steps and information about our next meeting. And if we do have time before wrapping up, we will be opening the floor for comments from any observers that are with us today. But I'll mention too that comments and questions can always be submitted through our public comment portal, the link to which we will put in the chat. And that portal is open at least through the end of this month. Next slide. So for those who haven't seen this already, this is the Transportation Working Group roster. I can see many of you are with us today. I know that not everybody could make it. There are 28 members in this working group, and all representing really diverse perspectives and viewpoints within the transportation sector. Next slide. All right, so we unfortunately don't have time to hear from everybody with an introduction, but I'm hoping that we'd like to invite you all to introduce yourselves in the chat so we can all get a sense of who's in the room. So if you could list your name, your affiliation, where you're joining us from today, and if you'll humor me with an icebreaker question, what is your favorite type of transportation and why? So I can kind of kick us off here. As I've said, my name's Jillian DeMedio. I am with ODO, or the Oregon Department of Energy. I live in Bend, Oregon, and that's where I'm joining from today. In terms of favorite type of transportation, I think a few years ago I would have said my personal vehicle. I love to go on long road trips, but I do have two little kids right now, and long car rides are pretty miserable. So I'm going to say my favorite form of transportation is my bike with the trailer attached. It's a great way to get around town with the kids. All right, so next slide. While you're all introducing yourselves in the chat, I'm going to pass things over to Jeremy to introduce the consultant team.
Thanks, Jillian. Hi, everyone. I'm Jeremy Hargreaves. I'm a principal at Evolved Energy Research, and I'm leading up the technical modeling piece of the energy strategy. And Evolved Energy is part of a larger team that's being led by Clean Energy Transition Institute. And Ruby, the technical project manager, is on the call today as well. And then we are also joined by Moment Energy Insights, Elaine Hart, and Rockcrest Consulting, Angela Long, who's on the call today as well.
Thank you, Jeremy. All right, next slide. All right, I'm going to kick us off now, set the stage for this project. For those who were able to join our working group meeting a couple weeks ago, you may recognize a few of these slides. So first, I just want to highlight something that I've sort of touched on already, which is that this is a two-phase project. The first phase is this technical modeling analysis. That is this series of working group meetings. That's what these working group meetings are about and what we're talking about today. And in the second phase, we will get to policy recommendations, really based on the outcome of the technical modeling. The final report is then due to the governor's office and the legislature by November 1st, 2025. We do have engagement opportunities kind of layered throughout this process, consisting, of course, of these working groups. We've also held a number of listening sessions and webinars. We have a 29-member advisory group that meets monthly, as well as an interagency steering group to involve our sister agencies within state government. We are also doing tribal consultation and environmental justice and equity outreach. And for those who, again, did join us last week, you'll know that we have 8 different working groups that have been meeting over the last couple weeks and that will meet again on August 22nd. So each working group is focused on a particular topic area of the energy strategy. And the purpose of the working groups really is to inform the modeling, or this first phase of the technical analysis. So we're providing information on data sources we're using, and then we're asking for your feedback on key assumptions and engaging around the types of questions that we may want to explore through our scenario modeling. So the goal of these meetings is not to come to a conclusion or consensus on any particular scenario or assumption, but it's really to hear your views and recommendations, and we'll then take what we hear in this working group and all of the others, kind of work through it and present what we've heard to the larger group in that later August 22nd meeting. I'll just share that in evaluating what we've heard, there are certain decision-making guideposts that we'll be following. So first, we're going to be using the best available information. We've already been working with a number of data holders in the state, including sister agencies, utilities, regional organizations, to really understand and incorporate the best data available. The model also needs to produce results that meet our climate goals and that maintains a reliable energy system. These are both directives from HB 3630. We'll also be looking to understand what the lowest cost options are, while also recognizing that there are many non-energy costs and benefits that we cannot incorporate into the modeling. So we are conducting separate analyses to evaluate some of these non-energy areas. So that includes jobs, energy bill impacts, equity and environmental justice impacts, impacts on land use and natural resources, et cetera. So again, where information is not aligned, we're going to be assessing the pros and cons of different choices based on these areas to inform our conclusions when we come back together. So next slide. So just a quick note on our legislation, HB 3630, which directed ODOE to develop the Oregon State Energy Strategy. That piece of legislation also set out the elements that we need to account for in the energy strategy. So today, as you know, we're focusing on transportation, but I do just want to point out that the energy strategy does have to address all of these cross-cutting areas. So that includes everything listed on this slide. I'm not going to read through it, but the point is really to highlight the scope of the work that we're undertaking here. As well, HB 36 also states that the strategy has to be informed by diverse stakeholder perspectives, existing state laws, policies, and targets, existing energy and integrated resource plans, energy-related studies and data analyses, and state energy policy objectives. So next slide. All right, so that brings me to this slide, which outlines the existing energy policy objectives that are really guiding our analysis. This specific term is not defined in the bill in HB 3630, but this is how we're framing it for the reference scenario. So that's the starting point for our analysis. The focus here is really on clean energy and climate policies, which are driving a fundamental transition of our energy sector in Oregon. So first, we have our economy-wide target set by Executive Order 2004, and that calls for an 80% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. We also have HB 2021, which sets a 100% clean electricity target by 2040 for our largest investor-owned utilities. And we have the Climate Protection Program, which sets a 90% greenhouse gas emissions reduction target by 2050 for natural gas, propane, and liquid fuels. So these are sort of the anchor policies that are driving emissions reductions across the economy and reshaping how we produce and consume energy in the state. At the same time, of course, we have numerous other important policies that help drive and shape compliance pathways. And many of these are related and relevant to the transportation sector. So you'll see the Clean Fuels Program, Advanced Clean Cars 2, Advanced Clean Trucks. All of these policies are also being considered and worked into the model as well. So just to summarize, our approach in the technical analysis is really to incorporate these policies into the model and build in compliance with these existing laws and policies. And that's what we do in the reference scenario, as well as all of our pathways. Next slide. So lastly, I'm going to end my portion here with a graphic representation of our approach to the modeling. You'll if you were able to join any of our other meetings, you'll recognize this slide once again. In the middle, you can see our reference scenario. This is a combination of reasonable assumptions that help achieve compliance with those climate and energy policy objectives that we just discussed. Those assumptions are really the basis for the first part of our discussion today. We'll then use 5 scenarios to sort of test what might happen if things work out differently than what is assumed in the reference scenario. So we will be changing certain assumptions in our reference scenario to get at these test scenarios. And this scenario analysis, or the process of comparing test scenarios to the reference case, is really where the learnings are happening in this process. So this is where those what if questions come in. So for example, if one of our questions that we want to explore, you can see on the slide here, through our scenario analysis, what if there is more or less transmission, or what if transmission in the state is constrained? The way we would do that is in the reference scenario, we would assume sort of unlimited transmission build out. And then in a test scenario, we would then constrain the amount of transmission that can be built. And what we learn is what more or less transmission means for the overall cost of decarbonization, what kinds of energy resources can be built, and whether they can be built inside or outside of Oregon. So all of these conclusions can then help us see effects as well on things like land use and jobs. So I do just want to emphasize that neither the reference scenario or the alternative scenarios are meant to forecast the future, but they are rather meant to really just lay out some of the ways we might meet our energy goals, and then highlight and better understand the trade-offs associated with each pathway. I'll also mention here, you can see we only have 5 test scenarios, and there are 7 other working groups that are having these same conversations. So I'll repeat this when we get to our discussion on the scenario analysis, but I do just want to set expectations that we're not going to be able to come up with 5 transportation-related what-if questions, but we may be able to play around with some transportation-related assumptions in 1 or 2 of the scenarios that we test. So with that, I'm going to kick it over to Jeremy now to talk more specifically about how transportation is considered within the model.
Great, thanks very much, Jillian. So what I want to do in the next few slides here is just set up some context for how we're treating transmission in the model, so that maybe when we get to the assumptions that are going in, those starting point assumptions, and then thinking about what if questions, there's a little bit of background to understand where those are plugging in here. So to start off with, I'll give a high-level overview of the modeling approach in general. We're starting with a model of Oregon's economy, and that means looking from the bottom up at all of the different energy consuming technologies across all of the sectors and subsectors, and how those technologies might change over time. So as people, go to the dealership to buy a new vehicle, are they buying an electric vehicle? Are they buying another internal combustion engine vehicle? Are customers buying heat pumps, or are they buying gas furnaces? So those kind of decisions are inputs into this model of Oregon's economy. So we want to do a good job of capturing what existing technology stocks look like today. And then based on those assumptions about what kind of purchases people may be making in the future, then how those stocks will change over time. And that'll translate into an energy need in each year going into the future across all the sectors and subsectors. How much gasoline, how much diesel, how much electricity do we require? And that second bucket there, that's the aggregation of all of those energy needs. So across the economy, how much electricity do we need to provide? How much liquid fuel, gaseous fuels? And given that need, then we move to the final bucket, where we're using our capacity expansion and operations model to work out how do we serve that need at least cost and reliably. And this is looking across all of the various supply chains to produce these different types of energy. So the electricity sector, supply chains to produce liquid fuels, supply chains to produce gaseous fuels, and work out what kind of infrastructure investments do we need and what kind of operations of those systems. This is constrained by the clean energy goals, it's constrained by the emissions goals, And it's specific to the particular scenario that we're looking at. So Gillian described the reference scenario and then 5 other scenarios. And those 5 scenarios may be representing different uncertainties on how things play out in the future, or it could be different policy priorities. So if these other external factors, the externalities that may drive, a different but desirable solution, if we're constraining those, then we can look at how do we meet our goals at least cost while meeting, say, jobs growth targets, those kind of things. Next slide. So just nesting that modeling process, the middle bar there, into the data needs for the project here. Starting on the bottom, we're looking for the best available data. So these are the data sets that are detailed representations of all of those stocks, our energy service demands, are things that would drive changes in energy service demands over time, like changes in population, describing all of the various technologies and their characteristics. What are their operating characteristics, their hourly energy needs, what are their capital operating installation costs. And same thing on the supply side as well. We're trying to capture what the existing energy infrastructure looks like to provide all of our energy needs today, and then what kind of investments are possible in the future that the model could select from to be able to expand our energy networks and meet our energy needs. And then moving to the top of the chart there, scenario assumptions. These are the things that will change between the different scenarios that we're looking at. So on the demand side, an example of that in transportation could be electric vehicle sales, where in one case, maybe we have relatively rapid rates of electrification happening. Another scenario could look at, for example, slower transition into electric vehicles and what would be the impact of that on the overall solution. We're looking at the policies that could impact those sales, like IRA. We're looking at supply side assumptions that limit the types of investments that we could make. So resource availability, when, where, and how much can we build in terms of renewables, in hydrogen infrastructure, in biofuels production, those kind of things. And then everything is constrained by the emissions target, by the clean energy targets. Next slide. And to understand how we are modeling the transition, and this is very pertinent to the transportation sector, we're using this stock rollover sort of structure here, where we're making assumptions going into the model about what kind of vehicle people are going to buy in the future when their current vehicle comes to the end of its life. And in the example at the bottom there, this is for a 100% electric target by 2035. So you see the sales going to 100% electric. And then how does that filter into stocks? That's shown in the second chart there, where we're in this example assuming a 15-year mean lifetime for light duty vehicles. And so we see this gradual transition going from ICE to electric as the vehicles come to the end of their lives and are replaced by electric, such that by 2050 we're close to 100% electric. And then the final chart there shows how that translates into energy demand. And we see this growth in electricity demand happening because of the electrification, but a significant decrease over time in total energy demand because of the greater efficiency of electric drivetrains compared to internal combustion engines. And we're doing this same process across about 80 different subsectors in the economy. Next slide. There are a few things to note here about modeling the transition in transportation. And I want to cover off the key inputs here, that when we are thinking about the starting point assumptions that Gillian will go into in the next part of the presentation, what are the inputs that are feeding directly into the model here? So we are not solving for the sales share of vehicles. That's an input assumption that's going into the model. And there's a variety of different factors that can impact those sales shares. So one of the key drivers in the last couple of years has been IRA. IRA has played this role of accelerating the adoption of electric vehicles. Then there are policies. So there's advanced clean cars, there's advanced clean trucks that have an impact on that. There is economics, so whether it's cost effective to be buying an electric vehicle or not. And then state policy as well. So all of these are factors that would go into what kind of sales we would see in the future. But we can't just make a simple economic judgment about whether a customer will purchase a vehicle or not in that set of conditions, just because so much of that decision comes down to personal choice. And so that's why we use this as an input rather than try and solve that in the model. So we're looking for what are those sales assumptions that would filter into the stock and then the energy for each of the scenarios that we're looking at. Then there are parts of the transportation sector that we can't model with that sales stock energy paradigm, just because we don't have enough information about the stocks themselves. So that would include aviation, maritime, rail, and industrial transportation. So on-site industrial transportation. We don't know what the number of planes, the number of ships, and the rate at which those come to the end of their lifetimes. So instead, what we're representing here is an energy demand by the fuel blend in those sectors. So how much gasoline, how much diesel, how much fuel oil, hydrogen, electricity, etc., is being consumed, and how we think that is going to change over time. And then finally, the one final note here is that we are including the Clean Fuels Program and the Climate Protection Program such that those are going to be in compliance in the results that we produce from the model. Next slide. So I just talked about the inputs, those things that are coming into the model. So what is the model actually solving for in transportation? And it's solving for the supply side. How do we provide the various different types of fuels in transportation over time? And the way that we are optimizing that supply side is looking across all of the various supply chains economy-wide to produce these various fuel types. And this table on the right-hand side there, which I won't go into in detail, but it shows some of the different infrastructure types that the model is making investments in. And so it's capturing not only the fuel demand within a particular segment, say gasoline or diesel, but also the opportunities for cross-sectoral coupling. And so in the future, say we take the diesel fuel blend, that diesel fuel blend could be met with fossil diesel, but it also could be met with biodiesel. It could be met with diesel that's produced from hydrogen or hydrogen-derived products. And so all of those opportunities are represented in the model. Next slide. So thinking about that in a little bit more detail, this shows the clean fuel supply and the types of pathway that primary energy can travel through to be transported, converted, delivered to fuel blends. So on the primary energy side, we have renewables, nuclear, natural gas, biomass, and noting here that this is not including the fossil fuels. So fossil can go to all of these fuel blends as well, but this is showing the various different types of process that could produce hydrogen, that could produce CO2 from different primary energy sources, and could be converted into longer chain products. So through processes like Fischer-Tropsch to produce different liquid fuel fractions, methanation to produce methane, Haber-Bosch to produce ammonia, or direct use of hydrogen in the economy. All of these different supply chains are represented as physical infrastructure investments and physical investments in transportation, storage, etc. Next slide. So taking those different types of fuel, that peach colored bar that we saw in the previous chart, then we can look at where those go in terms of end uses. And we can see in transportation where different fuels can fit in. So for example, if in the input assumptions, we assume that some level of international shipping is transitioned away from bunker fuel and into ammonia, then ammonia could go into shipping. Ammonia can also be blended up to a certain level into heavy fuel oil. We can see hydrogen being used in a variety of places. So it could be used in domestic shipping, in trucking, in trains, in on-road vehicles, in off-road vehicles. And then we see aviation biofuels from liquid hydrocarbons that are drop-in fuels, or hydrogen-derived fuels that are going into liquid hydrocarbons can replace fossil fuels there. And then heavy hydrocarbons that are going into manufacturing and other parts of the industrial economy. Next slide. And I'm just showing this as a kind of high level example of a supply chain. So we have clean energy going into electrolysis producing hydrogen, and the hydrogen can go a variety of different routes. So it could go into methanation to produce methane gas for blending into gas pipelines. We can blend hydrogen directly into gas pipelines up to a certain percent. And the rule of thumb that's being used by gas utilities in Oregon is up to 20% by volume. We could transport 100% pure hydrogen in new hydrogen pipelines. Hydrogen could go into Fischer-Tropsch synthesis, combined with some source of carbon dioxide to produce drop-in fuels for various forms of transportation, or hydrogen could go into Haber-Bosch for ammonia production and potential use in maritime transport. Next slide. And I'll end here with a note on the biomass feedstocks. So we are incorporating existing biofuel supply. So fuels that are coming from waste oils, from various sources that are already being used in biofuels production, as well as anaerobic digestion gases. So those things that are coming from agriculture, from landfill, etc. And then on top of that, we are using new sources of biomass from the DOE billion-ton study. So these are things like the corn crops and potential use of corn, not just in ethanol production for gasoline blending, but in alcohol to X processes, new types of biomass that can be used for biofuels production in the future, as well as waste biomass, cellulosic biomass from things like the forestry industry. And this is an area where we know that there would be better estimates for Oregon specifically of what kind of biomass is available. We have the option of using work that was done by the Washington State University for the Washington 2021 State Energy Strategy. They used their LURA model for that study. But any specific sources that people know of here that we should be incorporating, that would be great input. So with that, I'll pass it back to Gillian and get into the starting point assumptions.
Great, thank you, Jeremy. Before jumping into this, I just want to pause for a moment to see if anybody has any questions on anything that was just presented. So not necessarily on the data and assumptions, which we have time for in a moment, but on what the slides that Jeremy just went through. I think I see, Rebecca, your question in the chat. I think that's relevant here. So Jeremy, Rebecca asked, are you also considering hydrogen as an input for producing sustainable aviation fuels?
Yeah, it's the same process there as well, where into aviation fuels, we can blend biofuels, we can blend hydrogen-derived fuels, and so those can go through Fischer-Tropsch. They can come from various biomass and biomass conversion processes that exist today, and that we could foresee being a big part of that in the future. And so the blend there is optimized based on which one of those pathways or which combination of those pathways is least cost.
Thank you so
While
much.
also, sorry, I just add while also meeting the emissions constraint. So just at that point, go ahead, Rebecca.
And I just thank you for clarifying that. The reason that I wasn't sure was because the slide with the kind of the peach bar, clean fuels demand, it didn't have an arrow from hydrogen going to aviation, but then your next slide did seem to include aviation. So thank you so much for the clarification.
Yeah, so that the clarification there is that we are not assuming any aviation is converted to direct use hydrogen. That is a potential option in the future, but our starting point assumption is that we remain burning jet fuel basically going into the future, but that jet fuel can be decarbonized through a variety of different fuel blend processes.
Got it. Thank you so much.
Any other questions on before we jump into the data tables that were sent out? Jessica, do you see any other questions in the chat? I don't see any hands raised.
No, just to flag that there's a question from Lewis, but we will get to that shortly.
Great. Thank you. All right, so Edith, you can go.
Question?
Oh, please.
Sorry, I believe I've been sending questions to P and I privately. I meant to send it to the group. This is Michael Graham from Clean Cities. I have two questions. The first was on the clean fuel supply graphic. How is renewable natural gas incorporated as a potential feedstock for low carbon hydrogen production? And the second question was, how are infrastructure costs or constraints factored into the various clean fuels modeling pathways?
So the first part is this is kind of the same answer as the last one, in that there is the opportunity for steam methane reforming with carbon capture, and the gas that is going into that can be decarbonized, or a blend of natural gas and renewable natural gas. So that is one way that it can get incorporated. The other way, which it tends to be the way that it gets used in the model, is that renewable natural gas is just used directly as a blend in the natural gas pipeline. And so there are costs and potentials for renewable natural gas that are based on the available anaerobic digestion sources. And then the second part of your question, which I believe was, how are the infrastructure, capital, and operating costs factored in? So each of these steps in the fuel supply chain processes, which would include the delivery of a commodity to an intermediate conversion step, and that conversion step could be things like electrolysis or Fischer-Tropsch, or any of the biomass conversion processes like BECCS or pyrolysis. That we have the capital infrastructure costs for those processes by capacity. So the larger the capacity that we're investing in, the more it's costing, and the operating costs, the efficiencies for those processes as well. And then downstream of that, we have delivery costs to either the next conversion process or into end uses, as well as storage options. So for things like hydrogen, storage may be a component of that process, it's pretty expensive. And so the model tends to try and minimize the amount of hydrogen storage that it's building. And that favors conversion into cheaper forms of storage. So if you can convert hydrogen into a liquid fuel, then the liquid fuel is very cheap to store. And we're actually assuming that is close to free, just because there are vast quantities of liquid fuel storage available today. And then the downstream part, the delivery, there are cost assumptions about what it takes to go like the final mile to fueling stations or to whatever end use that fuel is ending up in.
Awesome, thank you. One quick follow-up on the cost inputs for some of the renewable fuels and maybe incentives that are driving them. You might consider including the EPA's renewable fuel standard, because the RINs are an important component of the value included in biofuels and renewable natural gas. And while the pipeline direct use for renewable natural gas might be the highest and best use, the cost driver, the incentives are in the wrong place right now. So they incentivize use in the transportation sector because of the low carbon fuel standard and the renewable fuel, the standard RINs.
That's good input. Thanks.
Sure thing.
Thank you, Michael. Any other questions before we move on? Doesn't look like it. So I'm going to go ahead and say, let's go to the next slide. Okay, so I did send these next couple slides out last week, and I'm hoping that some of you had a chance to look through them, because I want to fully recognize this is a lot of information to sort of throw at you and not a lot of time to discuss it. But the next few slides will cover the existing data sources and assumptions that we're proposing will inform our reference case. To kick us off, this slide in particular shows the data sources for establishing existing conditions in the model. So you can see we're using Oregon-specific data wherever possible. So for light-duty vehicles, looking to the Oregon Department of Transportation, Driver and Motor Vehicle Division data, so DMV data. For medium and heavy-duty vehicles, again, looking to ODOT from the Commerce and Compliance Division, and also DMV data, because it does depend on the vehicle weight there. I'll just note that we are proposing to use EPA moves, the EPA moves model, if we are not able to obtain the data from ODOT, which I'll say that the data that is in EPA moves does come from ODOT. It would just be, a couple years older than if we could get the most recent data. For transit buses, looking to the National Transit Database, we have been told that that is the best source of Oregon-specific data. School buses, again, looking to Department of Transportation, DMV data. For fuels, Department of Environmental Quality's Clean Fuels Program. For vehicle miles traveled, Department of Environmental Quality, again, has some updated VMT numbers that ultimately comes from the EPA moves, which then comes from the Highway Performance Monitoring System. And then for fuel economy, looking to EPA moves again at the historical average fuel economy by vintage and vehicle type. So I'll pause here because I know, Louis, you had a question in the chat earlier about the VMT.
Sure, and thanks very much, Jillian and Jeremy. This is really great information. Appreciate your sharing it. So I can sort of see the modeling system is more of an energy modeling. So I understand these are inputs. I noted, if I read it correctly, I just read it quickly, that the VMT assumption was going into it was flat. And I have some background in this area, so I just wanted to check whether I read that right, and if so, where that information came from.
Yeah, so that is actually in the next slide. So that's looking out to looking at future conditions. We're proposing to reflect historical trends and keep VMT per capita flat out to 2050. And that does reflect historical trends in Oregon since 1990. And the rationale behind this is that while we do recognize there's a target for 20% reduction per capita by 2050 in the Oregon Transportation Plan. There really is no way to enforce that target. There's no funding tied to that target. And so our current proposal is to assume a constant VMT in the reference case, and then potentially explore what happens if we are able to reach that VMT target and reduce it in one of our test scenarios if we find enough support for that scenario. So that's kind of our proposal. I'm curious if that sort of alleviates your concern, or if you have additional information that.
No, at this stage, I appreciate the explanation. My suggestion maybe at this stage is if you can just, I guess I would just caution that you always state VMT per capita, because if you state just VMT is flat, then people in the transportation world might raise a bunch of eyebrows. So I get what you're saying to clarify that it's a VMT per capita going forward.
Right. Yeah, and I will, thank you, Louis. I appreciate that. I did get some feedback that it was wrong in the slide I sent out. So you'll see it corrected in this next version. So I appreciate that. Thanks. So I'm going to move on here, and I'll pause before we get to our discussion questions to see if there are any other questions or feedback related to the sort of proposed data sources. So Edith, can you go to the next slide? So this is again moving on to looking at future conditions. So Jeremy already talked about this in his presentation, but in estimating future vehicle stocks, we're looking at existing policy. So look for light duty vehicles, looking at advanced clean cars 1 and 2, and then for medium and heavy duty, looking at the advanced clean trucks rules. I'll say we're also going to be looking at the International Council on Clean Transportation put out a report with forecasts based on Inflation Reduction Act incentives. So the proposal is to also look at that report and kind of see how it compares to the sales targets in advanced clean cars and advanced clean trucks, and kind of use whichever is higher in our estimates. For transit and school buses, as well as medium and heavy duty vehicles past 2035, we don't currently have state policy or targets that get us to 100% zero emission vehicles. So that is the basis of our discussion in the next few slides. So I'm just going to kind of skip over that for now. Looking to fuels, again, we're looking at the Clean Fuels Program and also Portland's updated renewable fuel standard targets. And thank you, Michael. We'll also look into the EPA renewable fuel standard as well and see how that can be worked in. For vehicle miles traveled, again, VMT per capita in this reference scenario is assumed to remain constant or flat, which reflects historical trends since 1990. And the proposal would then be to potentially explore a reduction through one of our alternative scenarios. For fuel economy, again, looking to federal policy. So for light duty, looking at the CAFE and SAFE standards, and that the fuel efficiency would then remain constant after 2026. For medium and heavy duty, looking to EPA phase 3, and then annual energy outlook projections after 2032, which is when they sort of sunset. For buses, looking at annual energy outlook projection. And then aviation, looking at the net zero roadmap that was put out by the International Air Transport Association, which targets a 15 to 20% efficiency gain through 2050. So next slide. So lastly, a quick note here on sort of technology and fuel and infrastructure costs, because we know that this stuff has come up before. So looking to a series of International Council on Clean Transportation reports for on-road vehicles, for rail, aviation, and maritime, the costs are assumed to be the same as fossil alternatives because, as Jeremy explained, we do have a lack of data there. Fuel costs, looking to annual energy outlook 2023 oil and gas forecasts. On the infrastructure side, for hydrogen, the U.S. Department of Energy put out technical targets for hydrogen delivery. And then for infrastructure costs and estimates, currently for EV charging, looking to an NREL study called Electrification Futures. And I'll just note that we are looking into using a different tool by NREL called EVI Pro, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. And that is to better align with the methodology that was utilized by ODOT in their 2021 TINA study, or Transportation Electrification Infrastructure Needs Analysis. So if we can use EVI Pro to sort of have consistent methodology, we will. And I'll just say we're not planning to use TINA numbers just because that study was based on SB 1044 targets rather than Advanced Clean Cars 2, which gets us to 100% zero emission vehicles vehicle sales, I should say, by 2035. So that's kind of the rationale there. My proposal is to move on to our discussion questions, but I will pause to see if there are any questions on this stuff. I see Corey Ann, you asked, does the scope of this extend to off-road, so marine and rail, in addition to aviation? Jeremy, can you address that?
Yeah, so it definitely does. We are incorporating all of the fuel demands that the Oregon economy will see, and marine and rail aviation are all part of that. Those are not, as I was mentioning earlier, they're not parts of the economy we're representing with stocks, because we don't know exactly, how many ships, how many planes there are. But they are represented by the energy demand that we see in the CEDS database, and then forecasting how that energy demand might change over time. And then how do we meet that? Are we meeting that with fossil jet fuel? Or are we meeting it with a blend of jet fuel and other fuels, clean fuels that could help decarbonize the economy? So that's our representation in those sectors.
Any follow-up, Corey Ann, or are we good to move on?
We're good to move on. Thank you.
Sure. All right, can you go to the next slide? Great, so this, go
Jillian,
ahead.
sorry to jump in just really quick. I just saw that Robert Wallace had a question about off-road vehicles that might be good just to answer before you move on.
Great, so yeah, Jeremy, Robert's question is, how about construction equipment and farm equipment?
Yeah, that's included as well. That's in the industrial transportation demand. So it is a line item that we have a fuel demand for, but that is also an area where we don't have a stock. So it's an energy demand that we can determine how is best served in the future with the different fuel blending.
And then I'll just note here for the record that Michael Graham put a comment in the chat that it's likely safe to assume a 2 times cost increase for electric and hydrogen versions of rail, aviation, and marine. So that's just a comment there. And then he has a question, will fuel prices be geographically specific? For example, West Coast prices versus nationwide averages?
They are geographically specific. So the fuel prices include the Northwest Power and Conservation Council forecasts on what the fossil fuel prices are going to do over time. And then on the biomass side, biomass derived fuels could come from a variety of places across the US, and there are other places in the US that are forecast to have cheaper biomass. And if we're producing fuels in those places and importing them into Oregon, then those have a delivery cost associated with them.
Great, so I don't see any more questions here. So I'm gonna propose that we do move on to our first discussion question.
I have a quick,
So
question. I don't know if you saw that. Sorry.
I didn't, apologies. Yeah.
Cody Meyer, DLCD. I just wanted to put a pin in the VMT assumption that maybe we circle back at some point to talk about the assumption that it remains flat on a per capita basis. And just want to find, the Oregon Transportation Plan has a 20% reduction target. The statewide transportation strategy adopted by the OTC has that same target. And LCDC, our commission, also has adopted rules for the metropolitan areas in the state to force policies that will get to a 20% reduction in VMT per capita in the metropolitan areas just from household light duty travel. So recognizing that that's a subsector of VMT, I'm just seeing lots of other policies and regulations that we assume to come to pass. And I think that there's probably enough around the VMT to warrant including those assumptions, assuming that those policies and regulations would be coming true as well.
I appreciate that, Cody. I'm going to propose that we discuss that in the scenario conversation, and because I'd be interested to hear from this group whether there's more value in assuming that reduction in the reference case or exploring it through sort of a behavior change scenario, so we could truly see the value of VMT reduction. So if that's okay with you, does that work for you?
Absolutely, appreciate it.
Okay.
Thank you.
Jessica, are there any other, apparently I'm not seeing raised hands, so I just want to check with you first before I move on here.
I don't see any other raised hands right now.
Okay, great, thank you. So our first discussion question, we sort of talked about a couple slides back. We don't currently have statewide 100% zero emission vehicle targets for transit or school buses or medium and heavy duty vehicles past 2035. Which is as far as advanced clean trucks gets. And so, you know, this is a topic we'd really like to solicit feedback around from the group. And as a starting point for this discussion, we are proposing to look at the sales targets set by California's Advanced Clean Fleets regulation. This is a policy that has already gone into effect in California, and we know that at least Washington is considering a similar policy, and it's very possible other states will follow suit, which is what happened with advanced clean cars and advanced clean trucks. So this proposal would use the same sales target, excuse me, established by Advanced Clean Fleets, which is 100% zero emission vehicle sales by 2036 for all class 2B through 8 vehicles, and that would include transit and school buses. So that's a proposal on the table. Would love to hear from folks, their thoughts and reactions to that.
Just a quick clarification, the Advanced Clean Fleets rule is not a sales target. It's a regulation requiring fleets to phase out internal combustion engines vehicles.
Yeah.
100% zero emission. Okay.
Yeah, thank you for that correction. Yeah, absolutely.
Jillian, I see we have some questions here from Jana and also from Kyle.
Great. Are they in the chat, or do you want to go ahead? Kyle, it looks like who raised their hand first? Jessica, I'll let you dictate that.
I'm sorry, it looks like Kyle raised his hand first. Go ahead.
Great. Thanks and good morning. Hopefully you can hear me. Kyle Watley with TriMet. So obviously I'm more specific to public transit and understanding, but I was just curious. Obviously coming from California, I was previously at San Diego MTS, so I definitely understand a lot of the state mandates that were coming down specific to public transit as well. California Advanced Clean Fleets was somewhat part of that, not specific to public transit in the most sense because California Air Resources Board also put out the Innovative Clean Transit Rule regulation, which is specific to public transit. This is basically a purchasing mandate for all public transit agencies to go to 100% zero emission vehicles by 2040. And it started out on a percentage basis, and it actually recently went up in 2023, starting at 25% of all total bus procurements had to be zero emission vehicles, either battery electric or hydrogen fuel cell. And then going up to, I think it was 2029, then it becomes 100%. So I was curious to see if this was maybe part of that process, because this is more specific to public transit and outlines a clear goal of what we're seeing for what it's going to look like. And I really think there's going to be some good data analytics within that to start seeing how these transit agencies are starting to procure these vehicles. And I believe the California Air Resources Board is keeping track of that through some data analytics. Thank you.
That's super helpful, Kyle. So are you suggesting that potentially, having a different target for transit buses specifically, that that mirrors the innovative clean transit rule rather than advanced clean fleets?
I think it's because of the uniqueness for public transit and the requirements, mainly in the operating profile. As a lot of you probably already know, there's, for these vehicles, they're very new and specific to buses themselves. But the reality is what came through even in California is that, the demand for the operating profiles for these vehicles is extensive. And then the other side of that is really making sure we're able to get the infrastructure in place in time in order to be able to deploy the vehicles. So really understanding the technology was a big part of that innovative clean transit rule. Before they even put that as a bill and passed it, there was some very extensive comprehensive review of the technologies, understanding the operating profiles of each agency. Because as some of you probably already know, public transit, even though we do the same thing, technically we operate a little bit differently from each agency to agency. And obviously, the other side of this is these vehicles and infrastructure have environmental factor sensitivities too, depending on your climate. So just understanding all of those, I think ultimately helps, become more successful in deploying this, this zero emission vehicle technology.
Great. Really appreciate that feedback. Thank you.
Yeah, and I would add just one more. I don't know if Jeremy's been looked into this as well, but there's a really good database specific to public transit nationally as well. That's being, I think, produced and provided through American Public Transit Association, or APTA, through their Zero Emission Fleets Work Group Committee. I was actually part of that recently in helping understand a lot of these unknowns that we're looking at in terms of deploying this vehicle and technology type. But they are looking to put out an extensive list nationally that's going to incorporate obviously what agencies are putting out in terms of, bus type, vehicle type, between battery, electric, hydrogen, 40-foot, 60-foot, 30-foot buses, and or the infrastructure that they're using to deploy between each of the regions. So it might be a useful resource as well.
Yeah, that sounds great. It's not one that we've incorporated so far, so thanks for that info.
Thanks.
Jana.
Thank you. I think I need to qualify for medium duty and heavy duty trucks the fact that the technology is simply not as far along as the policy is. So Oregon has adopted the Advanced Clean Truck Rule, which says that beginning next January, a certain percentage of zero emission vehicles have to be sold in each classification before you can sell internal combustion engines. And the net result of that is that there will be no truck sales in Oregon starting January 1, 2025. There is nothing that qualifies. And so what you will find in Oregon is an aging heavy truck population, or you will find trucking companies moving out of state in order to be able to purchase the equipment they need. And so we need to be very careful in this conversation that we don't get ahead of where the technology is. There are some options for us to reconsider how we define things, and there are some more realistic timelines that we could adopt as a state. But at the moment, there's a lot of talk, for example, about hydrogen fuel cell trucks or hydrogen electric trucks, but they are years away from being commercially available, and they're horrendously expensive as well. But battery electric trucks, even though they have them in class 7 and 8, only go about 200 miles. And if you look at the needs in the trucking industry, 200 miles does not qualify. And it will take four battery electric trucks for every 3 diesel trucks on the road today, because you can't carry as much. And so there's some real technology limitations in all of this, and we need to be cognizant of that and recognize that in our modeling. Thank you.
Thank you, Jana. And I definitely appreciate that perspective. I'll just clarify quickly that, advanced clean trucks, whether the technology is there or not, is established policy. And so that piece is, we're not debating that specific target for input into the model. But what I'm hearing is that potentially adopting, an even stricter purchasing requirement starting in 2036 post advanced clean trucks is not something that you think is realistic. Is that a fair interpretation?
Well, if you're talking about 2036, I can't predict what technology will be available, but I can tell you what's available it will be available in 2025, and we are a long way from having a technology available that meets the industry's needs.
Sure. Thank you. Any other reactions to that? Michael, I see your hand up.
Yeah, I mean, the ACF rule is being highly litigated right now, and I mean, there's questions about uptake, and you're also, I don't think it's realistic to use that as the tool to get us to our zero emission goals, if that's what the model is trying to get out of this. Coming back to your discussion question, I mean, we're missing millions, hundreds of millions of dollars of incentive money that California has. Even their utilities are struggling with interconnection timelines for fleet electrification projects. You know, outside of some of the Portland area utilities, it's a very, I would say that the interconnection timelines might be a lot longer, just with some of the smaller utilities that are less resourced. So I just those are some of the factors I think about when you ask, you know, can ACF be used to achieve those goals in Oregon? I struggle to say yes, that it can. Also, we're a big fan of electric trucks. We've helped deploy a lot of them in the state. So I just want to, you know, couch that hesitancy there.
But they have limited application, Michael, correct?
Yes, it's definitely a limited application right now.
And if I just may add one other comment, I think we need to be also careful about what the energy needs are going to be to convert to battery electric. Daimler has their electric island down on Swan Island, and it's a 5 megawatt facility, and it will charge 3 Class 8 trucks, 3. So if you've got a 100 truck fleet, you're going to need the power supply demands of a small city. And so when you're factoring all of this, you need to be very cognizant that the charging infrastructure needed to move the trucking industry to battery electric is not there. The equipment is not there. The cost would be over $1 trillion nationally. And there just isn't as much, you know, if you're going to be able to meet those energy needs, there has really high energy requirements.
Mm-hmm. Appreciate these perspectives. I do want to put it out to the rest of the group. Any other reactions to the target posed, or the thought that it's potentially not realistic for Oregon? Go ahead, Kyle. Can't hear you. I don't know if you're on mute.
Apologize. Jana brings a good point there. You know, I think what we're also trying to do in terms of public transit is obviously balancing that technology advancement, understanding that, and unfortunately, even as I mentioned, for battery electric buses or hydrogen fuel cell buses, they're still in their early stages a lot of the way. So I guess maybe to Jeremy, in terms of the model, at least specific from a battery electric, you know, bus, there are some things coming down the pipe. Unfortunately, due to the pandemic, a lot of the bus manufacturers have now left the market. And so, you know, for hydrogen buses, there's only one bus manufacturer at this point in time. And unfortunately, what that's is doing, it's also constraining the production timelines of the vehicles themselves. So I know, you know, these are areas that we'll want to definitely consider in terms of the model of what it is potential. And then as going back is really the infrastructure timelines is what, you know, we've seen, and even what's been being deployed down in California specific to public transit has been having some experience some serious delays. A lot of it is still due to, you know, the supply chain out there, and a lot of the lead times for some of the major components that are needed, especially specific to electrification. So I guess just to consider those would be something definitely to understand moving forward.
You're on mute, Jillian.
Thanks, Jeremy. First, I said appreciate that, Kyle, and then was going back to Jen. I see your hand is still up, so I just want to ask if you have a new comment or if that's
I do.
an
I
old
have a
one.
brief one, and then I won't take any more
Great.
time. But I think I would hope in your modeling that you would look at some other alternatives. And I know that the definition of zero emission equipment is very narrow as it is today. And perhaps your agency would be, it would be appropriate from your agency to question the definition, because there have been some studies that indicate there are things we can do to decarbonize in the trucking industry. And I don't want to just sound like I'm all about no, because today's clean diesel truck is already removing about 98.5 to 99% of the particulate matter that from the tailpipe emissions. And if you couple that with renewable diesel as the fuel source, you actually end up with a better carbon intensity than a battery electric truck. So there are some other options that could be proposed, and those are the kinds of things our industry is trying to promote and work towards. We'd like to be participants in the discussion here. Like I said, I don't enjoy being a wet blanket at all of these conversations, but it ought to be at least recognized. As Kyle has mentioned, even for transit, the technology is not there, and he's got equipment that comes home at night and could plug in and charge up every night. But if you're an over-the-road trucker, you don't have that. And so we need to be at least realistic in our modeling. So thank you, and I'll stop here.
Appreciate that.
Thank you.
Kyle, your hand is still up as well. So I'm gonna move on to Juan for now, and then if you do still have a question, we'll come back to you after we hear from some other folks.
Okay, thanks.
Go ahead, Juan.
Yeah, my apologies. I was trying to start my video, but it doesn't seem to be working. I just want to echo what everybody's saying here. If we should go with this, what I think, and agreeing with the people who are speaking, not so realistic scenario of heavy duty, medium duty adoptions, what is the modeling on the grid resiliency? I mean, you can have a storm. What happens to these trucks? Also on the pricing of energy, but also on capacity constraints that we may have on that when you're talking about just the load that it's going to be taking. And then when you consider entities like that follow BPA, load following BPA customers who have access to clean energy versus now you're going to put us more in the wholesale market, trying to get this energy that is no longer be clean. So how are all these implications of energy and resiliency, distribution systems, local, but also from BPA to the utility customers or other providers, how are those being considered in these scenarios? And I agree that we should have different scenario considerations. Sure, this can be an idealistic one, but then what are the other more realistic? And your point about renewable diesel and things like that, those make sense. Those are cost effective, but this idealistic scenarios are really challenging to take. Thank you.
And thank you, Juan. And I'm going to turn it over to Jeremy to respond to your comments, but I do just want to say that your point at the end there is kind of exactly what we're getting at here, that we can assume this more aggressive electrification rate in the reference case and then test in an alternative scenario what happens if the electrification rate is much slower or vice versa. So that's kind of the point of this analysis, is we will be able to see the impacts on overall costs, on what that means for supply chain of building up other low carbon fuels, because I do just want to remind everybody that we do still have to meet those emissions targets. So whether it's happening through electrification or it's happening through low carbon drop-in fuels, we're going to get to those emissions targets, and it will have impacts across the board on economy, jobs, et cetera. And that's kind of what we're hoping this analysis will tell us. So Brett, I see your hand up, and then Kyle, but I do just want to go to Jeremy first to respond to Juan's first point.
Yeah, it's a really good point. So basically in the modeling, what's going to happen is that we have an assumption about how many vehicles are on the road of different types of technology. And that's going to correspond to a certain demand for electricity, and it'll be an hourly electricity demand. There'll be an assumption in there about how much flexibility there is. So if you're a residential customer with an electric vehicle, then managed charging is something that could do a lot for a utility in terms of infrastructure utilization. But as a commercial vehicle, there's a lot less flexibility there. with the potential to drive more capacity need on the system. And so there'll be cost estimates in the model according to the impact on distribution capacity, on grid capacity and energy demands. And as Jillian was describing, it is a whole economy solution. So what we'll see is that increase in cost in electricity, and then we will also be seeing the emissions impact of that, and what is happening in the rest of the economy in terms of emissions reductions. And so it's kind of looking across all of the various ways that emissions reductions could be accomplished and seeing what is a cost-effective pathway through that. And the conversation that we've just had, to me, is I think really helpful framing for another scenario or scenarios that maybe are representing many of the barriers that people here have been describing, where one great strength of this modeling is that we see what is needed to get to emissions targets in each one of these pathways. And then we can interrogate the infrastructure investment across the different sectors and ask ourselves, is that something that could be feasibly accomplished? Or is that something that will be a real struggle to make happen? And so in the other scenarios, we can look at potentially more realistic pathways, and we get the trade-off. We get the other side of the coin there, where if we move more slowly in vehicles, then what else do we have to move more quickly in the rest of the economy? And we can interrogate those movements as well. Is that a feasible thing to accomplish? So it's helpful to give us the whole picture, the whole economy-wide picture.
Thanks, Jeremy. So I do just want to note the time here. I see 3 raised hands, so I'm going to call on them and then suggest that we move on to the next discussion question, and then the second half as well. So we're a little bit behind, but Brett, you've been very patient. Let's hear from you.
Yes, thank you. And sorry to join late. I'm driving over the Coast Range. I'm tracking the Transportation Roadshow, so I'll try to make my comments brief here. But appreciate the conversation so far, especially on the modeling components around advanced clean fleets and advanced clean trucks and how those fit into the goals. I also just kind of want to raise, there's some research from the Rocky Mountain Institute, and I'm happy to send that to y'all as follow-up, that basically kind of analyzes the current medium heavy duty sector across all the classes, and in Oregon specifically, 57% of that sector can be electrified based on current routes using telemetrics data. So I think that's a really helpful metric. And then their analysis also found that I think if you were to take that 57% and put it into the current whole grid demand, it'd be about a 3% increase. And I just think that's a helpful buoying point to think about some of this, when it can seem like you're like, this seems like an immense amount of power. And then to that point that was just being made by Jeremy, I think it would be really, really helpful to look at the barriers on energization timelines, because one of the things we're hearing a lot about is fleets really want to, bring on medium heavy duty trucks into their fleet, but like don't have the capacity to get hooked up to megawatt level fast charging that would be necessary to really, effectively move their fleets. And so, I mean, we're hearing numbers anywhere between 3, 7 or 3, 5, 7 years sometimes to get that hooked up to a grid with the utility. So I think just flagging, like, if we were to remove that barrier, if we are to have more efficient energization targets, that would be really help expedite things. And so I think that would be something interesting to explore in the modeling as well. And I'll follow up with that RMI analysis as well.
Thank you, Brett. Appreciate that. Juan, you just put your hand down. Would you like to ask another question or provide a comment?
Yeah, thank you. I'll be quick. Jeremy, so in response to what you said, it sounds like you are making an assumption then, or the model will include assumptions on demand side efforts such as demand response and time of use to help leverage some of these capacity energy challenges that may come from the electrification side. And so I'm assuming you're following like Power Conservation Council assumptions on those and adoption and barriers. But yeah, is that what I'm understanding? That those are included?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so I'm not sure if I don't think we presented that in this slide deck, but the assumptions around the commercial vehicles is that in the future would get up to 1/3 of that fleet participating in flexible load, and it could be delayed up to charging could be delayed up to 3 hours. And so basically that charging shape could be moved backwards in time. And that is kind of a rough assumption about the types of use cases where that would be feasible. But for a lot of the commercial sector, it's not feasible to participate in flexible charging.
Thank you.
Kyle, I appreciate your patience. You're up.
No, thank you. And I apologize for bombarding a bunch of questions, but there's obviously a lot of things to consider. So thank you for this and the opportunity. But Jeremy, maybe to you, just a question in terms, because I think Juan also mentioned it too, and I want to echo it, is resiliency and redundancy within these systems. And energy is really important, especially obviously depending on your industry's operating profile, but for public transit, it's very necessary. Just because we do require, a minimum level of service and potentially emergency response in terms of, climate or certain incidents. So I guess I'm just curious to make sure that these are being involved in that model as well. And if there's areas to look at that and to understand what's coming down the pipe in terms of what's the need, beyond maybe just existing fleets transitioning, but also things that happen in terms of outages or, like I said, climate incidents. So thank you.
Yeah, it's a really good question. It's one that in our modeling, we are planning to a reliability standard for the system that is basically maintaining the level of reliability that we have today. And so that's not to say that there would not be outages. And the way that would be dealt with is through other types of investments where you have like microgridded systems. Today we commonly see that with hospitals, for example, where there are backup systems installed there. And we are not at the level of granularity in our model to be treating that explicitly, but that is something that in talking about the results, then it is a key piece of an energy strategy going forward. And so resiliency is a topic for the energy strategy. We wouldn't be covering it in the modeling, but it is definitely a component of the final strategy.
Great, thank you. And actually, I mean, this is more specific to public transit. Again, is also something that California did for public transit. Was actually there was a bill that was, I believe it was passed, that was allowing public transit to be on those emergency, considered an emergency or a necessary need. So meaning that they would have potentially resilient, systems in place that would be mandated through the California Public Utilities Commission or something along those lines to allow either like a second circuit to come into their sites in times of, like I said, incidents that happen. So, but anyways, thank you. Appreciate that.
Thank you, Kyle. So I'm going to propose that we move on to our second discussion question, but I will just remind everybody first that we recognize this is not a lot of time and we're throwing a lot of information at you, but also we have this public comment portal, which I don't know if someone put that in the chat, but if someone on my team could make sure that's in there. So you can always, if you have additional thoughts on any of these topics or think of new things later, please utilize that public comment portal. So the second discussion question here is really centers around whether or not we should set specific targets for hydrogen hydrogen fuel cell vehicles specifically in the transportation sector. And this comes from, as Jeremy explained earlier, the model does not optimize for the technology choice when it comes to consumer technology choices. And so if we think there will be, or if we want there to be a portion of zero emission vehicles in Oregon that are fuel cell electric vehicles, we have to, in the model, set a target for that as an input on the demand side. So I don't know, Jeremy, if you want to elaborate on that at all, or if you feel like that covers it.
Yeah, so it would basically be trying to look into the crystal ball and thinking about whether we would see a major influx of hydrogen vehicles in the future. Like the trend at the moment is towards electric, and other states that we've been working in have have been moving away from including large portions of hydrogen in the trucking fleet. But that's a question for this group. Should we be assuming some level of hydrogen fuel cell in the future? And in the past, we have included hydrogen just because it's unclear which way it's going to develop. And so having some hydrogen penetration in the 2040s would be representative of a potential industry that could exist depending on development pathways between now and then. And then on the rail side, again, what happens by 2050 in rail? And there's some areas of or portions of the rail network that would lend themselves to electrification, where there are heavy movement on shorter sections of line that could be electrified, but large portions of the US rail network are away from existing electricity infrastructure and would be harder to electrify. And so this is not based on any specific source, but the kind of crystal ball assumption that we're starting with here is that we have a movement into hydrogen in rail. And then maritime, the international starting point there is that we have a movement into ammonia. And so that's a retrofit that's happening in shipping, where it's changing out the mode of propulsion. And then some hydrogen, but not too much. And then in domestic, we get some electrification that we already see happening in domestic shipping, and also a movement into ammonia there as well.
And I'll just note, you'll notice that at least for rail and maritime, those percentages don't add up to 100. So the assumption there is that the remaining is conventional or low carbon fuels being used there. So this is kind of the starting point that we're proposing to get reactions from this group. Michael, I see you had a question in the chat. Jeremy, for rail, are we looking at class 2 and switchers only, or also including class 1 RRs? Is that railroads?
Yeah, sorry for the abbreviations and poor text.
Okay.
So I am not well versed enough in rail to make the distinction between those two things. This is just for the overall energy demand for rail transportation. And so if you have better ideas about what we should be assuming there, then please let us know. We can consider that in how we set these assumptions.
Okay. Yeah, it might be worth segmenting them out, because when I'm thinking of class 1 railroads, I'm thinking of the BNSFs, the Union Pacifics that leave the state. And then when I think of class 2s and switchers might be operated by the BNSF and Union Pacifics of the world. Those are going to stay predominantly within the state, like Portland and Western. And so maybe you have more of a likelihood that some of the local lines could achieve those targets, while the interstate lines might be harder to achieve those targets and might be more predominantly leading towards the diesel only targets. And then on the maritime, I was just curious, again, it's kind of that, does it stay within the state? Does it leave the state question?
Yeah, so domestic versus international, the international is leaving the country. So those are really long haul ocean going watercraft. And then domestic, that is within the state, or it is up and down the coast, the West Coast. And it also includes ferry transport as well.
And this could be completely too granular for this exercise. I was more just trying to understand what was being proposed.
Yeah, the level of granularity that we have is just that domestic and international. And that comes from the underlying data sets that we're using to represent that, coming from the EIA. But if you have more specific data, we could work with that to build it into the structure that we have. So for example, if there are Oregon specific data sets for domestic shipping, that would be useful for us to incorporate here, then that would be great information for us.
Yeah, I can share some potential data sets. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. And I do just want to flag a comment from Corey Ann. She said you would have to include Class 1 railroads. They are the vast majority of fuel consumed. So that's just a comment there. I'm going to go to Rebecca first, ask a clarification question. And I think I'm understanding this. Do these no, sorry. Are these starting points we're already planning to add to the model? So I'll just say, yes, but based on the outcome of this conversation, very open to changing them. I think we just wanted to present everyone with something to react to. So definitely this is not settled. That's kind of the point of this conversation. Did you want to elaborate on that at all, Rebecca?
Jillian, thank you. And thanks for clarifying. I asked that question kind of early in the discussion, and then you made it clear. And I was like, oh, never mind. But I did want to ask if it's all right, to what degree, if any, did the development of these assumptions draw upon the analysis in Washington Department of Commerce's recent hydrogen study?
Jeremy, I'm going to pass that one to you.
So it did not draw upon that analysis. So the way that it could have drawn upon that analysis is to have looked at the Washington Department of Transportation assumptions around medium and heavy duty trucks in respect to hydrogen uptake. And in past analysis in Washington, for example, in our Washington 2021 State Energy Strategy analysis, we assumed a 50% penetration of fuel cells in long-haul trucking by 2050. The recent analysis in Washington that was done by RMI last year has moved away from including hydrogen in long-haul trucking. Their analysis around the economics of those two options, it's pushing more towards the electrification side. And so in the hydrogen strategy work, we incorporated the Washington DOT assumptions on that rather than any hydrogen penetration in the future.
Thank you so much. But is it the same then with respect to maritime, where I think and ammonia use? I think that's definitely an area that this study identified future demand.
Yeah, that's a good point. So the maritime assumptions are the same as what we assumed in that hydrogen strategy in terms of ammonia uptake and retrofits of large shipping.
Excellent, thank you.
Great, thanks, Rebecca. I'm going to go to Indy next. We haven't heard from Indy.
Hi there. Yeah, just wanted to clarify, is the model assuming a particular color of hydrogen or a particular mix of, blue, green, gray, just because the amount of electrolytic production is going to be pretty consequential for the burden on the grid here in Oregon if it's produced here or really in the region?
Yeah, so it is open to the mode of production, but the type of production has an impact on the emissions associated with that. And so one of the earliest cost-effective uses of hydrogen is replacement of gray SMR produced hydrogen in refining. But in terms of we can build our SMR with carbon capture for blue hydrogen production. And then in terms of green hydrogen or pink hydrogen, we're not really making a distinction between those two. It's that we have to be basically compliant with the rules around 45V to receive the $3 a kilogram and count it as clean hydrogen production. And that's the majority of the hydrogen production going forward, because that $3 a kilogram credit is so valuable that it really crowds out any other mode of production.
Thank you for that. I'd love to follow up just a brief comment on the question at hand then. I think it could be really valuable to model a scenario with a particular target amount of hydrogen uptake, but I would be concerned about seeing that in the baseline or in every scenario, just knowing that we are very early days with supply chains in the region for green hydrogen and the cost balanced against just the needs for other clean energy sources, the electricity and water required to produce it. I think it could be valuable to get a cost and impact comparison of hydrogen versus leaning on more battery technology, particularly as that's improving so rapidly. But I would be concerned about taking it as read in most or all scenarios that we're going to see a certain share of adoption, particularly in ground transportation. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Indy. Appreciate that perspective. I'm going to go to Brett next.
And you got the first part of my question, but I guess I would also have a question for Jeremy and folks about the assumptions around fuel cell versus hydrogen internal combustion. It seems like when I talk with industry partners that fuel cell is the future, but there are certainly some ancillary impacts of combusting hydrogen in an internal combustion engine, right? So I'm just curious if there's any distinction there in the model or not.
No, we are just including fuel cells. So if you had information about why we should be also including other technologies, we could incorporate that. But from what we've seen, fuel cells are kind of the dominant technology there, at least the way that prices are forecast going forward.
Great. Thanks for that comment, Brett. Corianne and then Jana.
Yeah, hi, Jillian. Actually, my question kind of goes back. It's not specific to this question, so I'll throw it out there. We can maybe respond to it later. But I am kind of similarly to Rebecca's question earlier about what we're socializing right now. I mean, I thought we were trying to socialize assumptions for the base scenario, right? So the base, and so I guess I'm getting a little confused as far as how we are considering assumptions out to 2015 that aren't already in regulation somehow, right? I mean, there's a lot of industry experts on this working group, and I can tell you what I think for biofuels, right? But that's not a base. It's not a regulation. It's not a mandate. I mean, it's market driven. There's a lot of question marks as far as whether it will really happen or not. So I guess I'm getting a little confused about the base scenario versus the other scenarios, right? And we're not to the other scenarios yet.
Right. So if I'm understanding you, so I think as you noted, established policy is not up for debate here, where that is going to be an input into the model. What we're talking about is areas where there is no established policy. Do we want to set targets for those areas? And so as I noted to Rebecca, that's up for debate. That's why we're having this conversation. There's nothing that has been decided yet. I wonder, Jeremy, if you could speak a little bit to why it might be beneficial to consider a more aggressive electrification scenario in the reference case versus in one of our pathway choices.
Sure. So in the reference scenario, we are including current policy, which includes taking the vehicle stocks to a certain level of electrification. But most of that policy is taking us through 2035. And the emissions policy and clean electricity policy is taking us through 2040, 2050 for the economy. And meeting 80% emissions reductions by 2050, that's going to require more than 80% reductions in the energy sector, because a lot of the emissions that will remain when we've got to 80% reduction are from the things that are really hard to get rid of, like the emissions of methane and N2O from agriculture. And so energy would have to compensate by taking us lower than that, or more than 80%. And so the meeting that target with significant amounts of fossil fuel consumption in 2050 may be a more expensive thing to do than if we past 2035 continued on a course of further electrification in things like transportation, so that by the time we got to 2050, we were at a level of clean vehicle use that was a lot higher. And therefore, it would be easier and cheaper to get to that 90 or 95% emissions reductions in energy at that stage. So that's the thinking behind the reference scenario, and what should we be assuming beyond 2035. And then on the other scenarios that Gillian was teeing up, those are just getting your out of the box thinking about the things that are going to be most important for us to question about the reference scenario. So what do we think is a real stretch to achieve in there, and what should we be investigating alternatively to see what the impact of that would be? And we heard a lot of great input already of the kinds of barriers that are going to impact that. So the availability of technology right now, the need for expansion of distribution systems, and potential challenges, particularly in areas that may be smaller utilities, rural areas that maybe have less strong networks that they can rely on for expanding to supercharging networks. And so all of those are potential barriers to actually getting electric vehicles on the road. And alternative scenarios that look at outcomes that come from those barriers are things that we can investigate in these other 5 scenarios. And so that's the intention of the second question, just getting your thoughts on what are these what if questions that would be most valuable to us to learn from the energy strategy. And I don't want to put words in your mouth by saying that that's the what if question we want to look at. Whatever you feel in transportation is an important thing for us to understand the trade-offs across the different solutions in the economy. That would be valuable to us to get your input on.
Yeah, actually, thanks for that, Jeremy. That makes a lot of sense. And I guess the thing that I haven't seen yet, and I know this is just the first meeting, is that assumption about if the rest of the economy outside of transportation can't meet those 80 or 90% reductions, and that transportation will have to the effort here is to try and see if transportation can get to 100 to be able to compensate for maybe like the lack of doing so in other sectors, right? That's a big assumption. That's a big leap to kind of go to, because this conversation today is entirely about transportation being zero. And I guess I would argue that that there are other ways to significantly decarbonize transportation, and not maybe zero, right? And when you line it up against the other parts of the economy, you'll see cost effectiveness, and the cost of the infrastructure, the cost of the vehicles, the cost of the fuels, all that kind of stuff. And I'm really curious to see how that kind of compares to some of the other sectors.
Appreciate that, Corianne. So I just want to note the time here. We've about 14 minutes left, and we still haven't gotten to our discussion around scenarios. So we have 5 hands up. I kind of want to put this to the group. Do we want to take these questions and comments at the risk of not having time for that scenario conversation? Or do folks want to submit their questions and comments in the chat or through the comment portal so that we can move on? Any thoughts there? Go ahead, Jana, I see you.
Well, I'll be very, very quick. I am just questioning the assumptions you're basing this off of, the 80% electric, 20% hydrogen. I will tell you from the industry perspective, we're almost looking at it in reverse. And you have one of the original equipment manufacturers right in the state of Oregon. It'd be really meaningful to talk to Daimler, but I've talked to all 3 of the OEMs, and hydrogen seems to be, in terms of decarbonizing our industry, seems to be what we have our bets on at the moment. So I would just take a look at that.
Appreciate that. Thank you, Jenna.
Hmm?
We haven't heard from John yet, so I'm going to go to John next, and then I'll move on to Lewis.
Thank you so much for calling on me, but I can probably just include my question in the chat and let you keep going with the presentation.
Appreciate that. Thanks, John. Lewis?
Oh, I'm trying to put it in the chat, but basically my short version of my question is whether the modeling system allows for interaction effects. So I was thinking about what might be helpful to say from the Port of Portland experience is that we're finding that, like, in order to electrify, say, the marine cargo system, we need to make significant investments into our electrical backbone. So, for example, we have a capital project recently for $8 million just to modernize the electrical system on the land side that the ships could plug into. Similarly, at the airport, we face, like all the car rental companies, they want to offer electric cars. But the problem is really on the land side, we're sort of reaching the limit of our electrical capacity. So I'm just wondering if there's any way to sort of take into account these complex interaction effects.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we would not be getting specifically down to the investments at the port, for example, but we would be factoring in the increased need in transmission and distribution to be serving those electrical loads. And in looking at scenarios that had varied levels of electrification versus retaining fuel blends in vehicles that they would be decarbonized by some kind of drop-in fuel, then the trade-off there would be between the investment in infrastructure locally and in distribution systems versus the investment in infrastructure more remotely in fuels production, potentially hydrogen production from renewables and the conversion infrastructure for producing those fuels and delivering those fuels. So those are kind of trade-offs that we would see.
Yeah, I think it's more, I'm sorry, Jeremy, I think I posed it more as a rhetorical thought question. Like I wasn't actually looking for an answer right now, but if you could think about that as you're going through the work, I'd appreciate that.
Sure.
All right, thank you, Lewis. I am going to move us on here. We have about 11 minutes left. I just want to say I really appreciate this engagement so much. So thank you all. And I'll just encourage folks, please don't just let your questions and comments go. Please submit them either in the chat or through our comment portal. We will definitely be reading and addressing all of them. So this is the section where we talk about these alternative scenarios or levers. I think a lot of these questions have already come up. So we've already heard from many of you that you would support some type of scenario that looks at these things. We kind of put these together as examples so that you could kind of see what we're thinking there. So you see this first one is uncertainty around the rate of electrification. As many of you have noted, we are proposing a pretty aggressive electrification rate in the reference case. So one potential scenario could look at what if electrification of transportation happens much slower than expected due to all of these various barriers that we've listed. How does this impact the overall cost of decarbonization economy-wide? How does it impact other sectors and how quickly they need to move, as Jeremy has noted? How does it impact the level of renewables needed to meet load growth, et cetera? Another example that, again, we've heard of, Cody, this is a great opportunity for you to chime in here again on VMT. What if we do explore in a scenario meeting those VMT reduction goals, 20% per capita by 2050, or some other goal? What does that mean for the overall cost of decarbonization and the overall energy demand, et cetera? How much money might this save us as a state? And then Indy, this is a perfect example of your question around hydrogen. So you had mentioned that the supply chains are not, are in their infancy. So what if hydrogen end use markets or supply chains do not develop as quickly as anticipated, and we can't meet those hydrogen targets that we've put in there? Or what if hydrogen is more expensive than anticipated? So I'm going to kind of leave it there and turn it over to all of you to come up with other questions that maybe aren't highlighted here, or to express support or lack thereof for any of the questions noted here. And I'll just do that quick reminder that we do only have 5 scenarios. Every working group is talking about their priorities in terms of testing scenarios. So it's very likely we can only test, 1 to 2 scenarios will play around with transportation assumptions. So I just want to set that expectation. And now I'm going to stop talking and hopefully hear from you all. John.
Hey, thank you. So I suppose my question in the chat is pretty applicable here, although I might agree if someone said maybe this isn't like one of the primary levers that defines a scenario, but I'll just read it. I'm curious about the modeling assumptions you're making regarding smart charging and potentially vehicle to grid technology. And I'm asking because I presume any assumptions here would impact the cost effectiveness of the electrification pathway relative to the direct use transportation fuel options.
So
yeah,
we
great
are.
Question. Go ahead.
Yeah, good question. We're starting from an assumption that we don't have participation in smart charging today, and that is going to increase over time to reach 2/3 of the residential vehicle fleet. And the smart charging there is assuming that they can charge overnight, so they can move their charging around overnight. With commercial vehicles, then it is building up to 1/3 of that vehicle fleet participating and delaying their charging shape up to 3 hours. We are not in the starting point assumptions here assuming any vehicle to grid participation, but we can include that if this group thinks that is a realistic and likely outcome in the future. Just what we've seen in past studies is that the smart charging or managed charging is a very cost-effective thing to do, and adding vehicle to grid on top of that doesn't give you as much. It's diminishing returns after that, but happy to have that conversation.
Thanks so much for that. And yeah, just my 2 cents regarding vehicle to grid. It seems like much more difficult to implement. So just high level, the assumptions you're making align with my thoughts.
Thank you, John, for that. Lewis, I see your hand is up.
Just to get on the VMT one, I mean, I'm sort of following you through the process, but a goal is good. I just put a comment in the chat, but ideally want to show a pathway. So you want to stack policies or market changes to show a pathway. I hope that's what you're hoping or planning to do, that you wouldn't just like run a scenario with a goal that doesn't show a pathway to feasibility.
Yeah,
Jeremy, go ahead.
So it is a pathway going through to 2050, and at different, it's going to be 5-year time steps on that pathway. And so to your question about feasibility, I think that's one of the big outcomes of this. We see what kind of infrastructure investments are needed in each of these years going forward in the future, and we can ask, is that a feasible thing to accomplish? Is it a stretch goal? Is it something that could be supported by policy to accomplish? Or is it really something that would be very, very difficult to get to? And so when we're comparing the different scenarios, that is one of the main criteria that we'd be looking at.
I do just want to clarify though on the VMT piece, and Lewis, I'm not sure if this is exactly what you meant, but the modeling analysis won't outline the policies that get us to the VMT reduction. It won't outline a pathway there. For example, increase, transit routes and opportunities. But that is something that we plan to take up in the policy section and those policy conversations. So I don't know if that's what you were getting at, but I do just want to clarify that piece. And then I'm going to move on to Cody.
Thanks. Yeah, just based on the discussion, I feel like one of the scenarios really should be focused on like optimistic implementation of our policies, that we have these policies and they're all a little bit uncertain. We're predicting the future. If we have a policy for sales targets and all these things, then that, heavy fleets are going to switch over, but there's some uncertainty there that I feel like if we're restricted to only a couple scenarios, that one should be there are policies in the state, and if those came to fruition, this would be the effect. But then another scenario would be saying, let's back off of that by whatever amount and say, well, if there's uncertainty, what if we don't achieve those policies? And the delta between those would show the benefit of the policies. And then you could also explore maybe just some bundled scenarios if, we went full in on electrification or hydrogen or what have you. So different mixes there, but it just really seems like the overall question really is like, how far are we going to achieve these policies?
So I think what I'm hearing, and I'll just, the way that I'm looking at our reference scenario is that optimistic viewpoint. That is the reference scenario. We're meeting, all of our policies as well as some others that we've set after existing policies. Well, we do meet all of our policies throughout this modeling, but the reference scenario is taking this more optimistic view, or at least that's what we're proposing, specifically around electrification. So I think I just want to get clarity from you. Are you saying that we should include that VMT reduction in the reference scenario rather than testing it through one of our test cases?
I think so, because I think I'm hearing a lot of uncertainty on a lot of the EV and, like all of this stuff is uncertain if we're going to achieve those policies. And I really don't see that the reduction of household light duty vehicle driving. I mean, even considering the trends are that people have not been increasing the rate they drive on a daily basis for years now, quite some time. And the trends on vehicle ownership are not exactly encouraging. So I feel like if you just kind of like look at them side by side, then I think there's a pretty good case to be made that we should assume that VMT going down by 20%, which is not that much on a personal level, would be in the reference case. Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Cody. Kyle, I see your hand is up.
Thank you. I'll try to be brief. I don't want to take too much time. Obviously, we're got a minute left or less now. But just curious on, one area that we're also considering is, what if the technology doesn't advance fast enough for us to meet our operating profiles? I don't know if this is built into the model to some way. It's both for infrastructure and more for us is the vehicles, because, what we're trying to do is do a comprehensive review of the vehicles and infrastructure technology to see if it meets our operating profile and eventually get there, because as of right now, it doesn't meet all of our operating profile today, meaning the zero emission vehicles holistically. That's why we're driven to do both technologies, meaning battery electric buses and hydrogen fuel cell, because of the operating profile that is our demand. So I'm just curious if, obviously this is more specific to probably, what if electrification of transportation happens slower than expected, but I'm just curious if there's areas that you're able to utilize some existing data that's already coming down, maybe more specific to public transit on some levels, that could help understand that, maybe for you, Jeremy, to look into as well, or consider. I think there's some good avenues, like I said, with the innovative clean transit rule in California. They're already having some of these areas pop up and maybe having some additional data sources. And then I think along the lines, APTA as well, nationally, to show some of that comprehensive review of technology. And a lot of this, and I apologize, but it's specific to public transit, but obviously an area to consider. Thank you.
Appreciate that. I do just want to quickly, Indy, I see your hand up. I'm just going to get to a question in the chat really quick, because I think it's a good one from Sylvan. If exploring VMT reduction, are trips assumed shorter or fewer or replaced by other modes? And are the costs for developing infrastructure for other modes included?
So there are two ways that we can implement that. One is that we have a reduction in the number of vehicles, but people are still driving the same or whatever amount of VMT per vehicle we want to set. Or we can just assume that we have the same number of vehicles going forward, but they're driving less. So the first of those has a much bigger impact on capital cost. But both of them have the same impact on overall energy infrastructure needs.
Thanks, Jeremy. And Sylvan, did you want to express support for any method of capturing that, or just had the question? Are you still with us? Perhaps not. All right, I'll move on to Indy.
Yeah, thank you. I wanted to respond a bit to Corey's point on the sort of the assumptions, or sorry, Cody, my bad. On sort of the optimistic scenario in a baseline versus one of the alternatives is being modeled. I would have concerns about assuming like most optimistic policy implementation in a baseline or as a given. Just looking at where our biggest projects are, we have capacity expansions in the pipeline in the Portland metro area that are likely to increase vehicle miles traveled in aggregate, at the very least in our region. We're struggling to fund a lot of the alternatives at the scale that we really need, like transit, active transportation. We obviously have a huge budget crisis at ODOT that's exacerbating that problem. In the short, obviously, looking out to 2040, 2050, I'm really hopeful that we can address some of those problems at scale. But in the near term, I'm not seeing all of the indicators that I would be looking for to say that our baseline scenario is 100% on time implementation of these strategies. But I do agree with you that illustrating the gap between that best case full implementation and a more, let's say, pessimistic outlook on what if we don't manifest this funding, what if we don't adjust our behaviors as individuals or as a population, is going to be really important, because I think that's going to tell us a lot about the costs to our entire system, our entire economy, of leaning into these policies versus leaning out.
I appreciate that, Indy. Thank you. So I know a lot of folks had to drop off. I appreciate everybody that has stuck with us, and thanks for all of the engagement today. This has been a really great and interesting conversation. I wish that we had more time, but I'll just remind folks about our public comment portal. So please continue to submit comments there. And then we're going to be wrapping up this initial engagement through the working groups in our August 22nd meeting, when we bring all of the groups back together and kind of present what we've heard and what we're proposing moving forward. So we do hope to see you all there. And with that, I think I'm going to close this meeting, and just thanks again for your time today.
Thanks, everyone.